Okay, so my presentation was meant to set the stage a little bit and to contextualize the following presentations that will be given to us over these 2 mornings. And so I entitled it 20 years after Pallier, Colomé and Sebastian-Gallés, 2001, which was a defining moment in this field. So I'll explain a little bit about this. And so, yeah, let's go. Okay. So we use language every day, right? We use language to talk about people, events, objects, and these do not need to be physically present around us. And a very important concept in cognitive science that is connected to this is the concept of mental representations. So we use a lot of different types of mental representations all the time, and in the domain of language, we have representations for concepts, for words, and also for other elements of language, right? Some things that are smaller than the word, bigger than the word, such as categories, grammar, syntactic representations, and so on. And so what's important to know about representations is that they are connected with one another. They relate to one another. There are lots of interconnections and networks among representations. For example, all words in the language are connected to one another. And they also can be combined with one another, with rules, and essentially infinitely, so that language is a very productive system. What's important is that these representations must be shared by members of a group to enable interaction. And they are acquired, I would say, very early. Human infants start to acquire these representations very early from birth, and mainly through exposure, not only, but a lot of those representations are acquired by being exposed to them and by interacting with them. And I'm going to talk a bit more about words now. So this is what this topic is about. And representations for words are, in fact, complex and multiple, right? They contain multiple kinds of information. And so we can take an example here of 2 girls talking. And one of the girls may be pronouncing a word in a sentence, something like fleur. And so the other child will hear this item, okay, within the sentence, and her perceptual system will recognize it and activate a connected representation, which is here the concept of fleur. So this is a lexical representation that contains a lot of different kinds of information. And so, of course, when we know a word, we know what it means. Okay, so we have the meaning of the word that is part of this representation. We know what it sounds like, so we have a phonolexical representation for this word. And then we have also a lot of other types of informations connected to it, such as the orthography, the way it's spelled, the grammar, the grammatical category. We know it's a noun, we know it's feminine in French, we know how the plural is made, etc. So this is just a snapshot of what could be contained in a lexical representation. And so children acquire these representations through interaction, as I was saying, and through listening. And this is important. In the first language, listening is determinant to create this representation. And so the phonological system, so all the sound categories, the phonological structures that we acquire for our first language, this phonological system is mirrored in these first language representations. So I use L1 to mean first language, the native language. And so let me illustrate what I mean with that. So let's assume these 2 girls are French speaking, and so the shape of the sound of the words in their lexical representations will be French, right? It will contain French sounds. But if this girl were growing up in the United Kingdom, for example, if she had English as her first language, the sound of the words would be English-like, right? So we would have a slightly different pronunciation of the word. It would sound rose and not rose, okay? Other than that, the other types of information would be of the same kind, but simply not of the same language. Okay, and so what we can say here at this point is that in the first language acquisition process, perception and phonolexical representations are tightly connected. They mirror one another. And that is beautiful. But in a second language, that is also where things become complicated. And so in a second language, these representations are not always target-like. So when, for example, this French child, if she were learning English, right, the representation that she might build for the same concept might be slightly different, okay, might not sound as British as it could be, for example. So these representations are not always target-like, and in particular the phonology. And so we know that L2 learners confuse words, but they confuse words in many different ways, right? They may say the word, they may confuse the word when they say them, when they hear the words, but also when they read or even when they write the words. And so I like to show this because it's an interesting menu, and you can't see it very well here in this room, but I have increased the size a little bit, and so it's a pizza place. And so what you can have there is hot paper on your pizza as a topping. And so this is an example. It's not just your average typo, right? It's in fact a phonological typo. It's a very interesting typo because it suggests that the maker of the sign has confused, obviously they're not putting paper on the pizza, they probably meant peppers, right? Pepper, red pepper, hot peppers, etc., not paper. And so what's going on here is that probably the maker of the sign has a vowel confusion in their mind, and it comes out when they write the words. This is another example that I pinched from Svetlana, actually, back in 2012. This is, I think, in Korea. You may have taken this photo from Korea, I'm not sure. Okay, yeah. And so what's going on here, do not little, it's probably a confusion between R and L, right? And so what probably the maker of the sign wanted to express was litter, essentially do not throw garbage around, yeah. And so these are, we find them just 2 days ago. I was at a restaurant, and again, I was able to choose red paper for my dinner. So these are quite common. And so one of the possible explanations for these phenomena is that the way L2 learners remember the pronunciation of the word in long-term memory is imprecise. So their phonolexical representation perhaps is imprecise in certain ways. Okay, I don't actually say here that they think paper and pepper is the same, right? They don't confuse the concept. It's something about the phonology in the mental lexicon that could be at play. And so, of course, the consequences of imprecise lexical representations can be quite dire. In fact, you might, starve. No. But more seriously, it's important. So they impact not only production, so intelligibility, but they also impact word recognition and the ability to decode spoken conversation in everyday life. And that's important, I think. And also, as we saw above, they impact reading and writing in L2 because everything is connected. The phonology, the vocabulary, the syntactic structures, they are all interacting with the various skills that we use in language. And so how did it come about that today we work on this and that we ask what learners' representations are like? Well, this is in part thanks to these researchers back in 2001 who gave an important starting point. And I can see Christophe Pallier here, Ángel Colomé and Sebastian-Gallés, all working in Barcelona. And so, they gave a starting point. Most of what we know today about these is thanks to all of us here in this room, is thanks to all the researchers who have collectively, with their research groups, not just us, who have contributed an enormous proportion of what we know today. And so what I'm going to show you now is my very brief, very personal, and very incomplete overview of how this research area began and where it is today. And so it didn't start in 2001, but rather in 1931. Notice the pattern with the ones here. So back then, for 90 years ago, Polivanov published this really interesting paper in French. And essentially, he claimed that listeners do not perceive an L2 in the same way as native listeners do. So we've known this for 90 years, right? So he said that L2 learners seem to speak the L2 through their native language, and they also perceive it through their native language. And in fact, so he was the first to propose this without evidence other than anecdotal. And then for the next 90 years, the research has just essentially collected evidence that he was right. And there was a large gap, again with the 1971 one date, a large gap of about 40 years in which not much happened. And then in 1971, Goto in Japan published, to me, and maybe I'm wrong, but I think it's the first experimental evidence that L2 listeners have perceptual difficulties and that their production difficulties could be connected to these perceptual difficulties. And so this is also a very important paper. And there might be something before that, but to me it's almost the first L2 phonology paper out there. Anyway, but there have been many more since then. And so this is what he wrote in French in this wonderful volume in 1931. And so I have made a translation into English, which is that. So he said, the phoneme and the other phonemic representations for our native language are so intricately linked to our perceptual activity that even when we hear words or sentences from a language with an utterly different phonemic system, we are inclined to analyze these words in terms of our native language phonemic representations. So this is very visionary back then, especially when you consider that the concept of phoneme was about 1 year old. It's very, very early. And I think I always like to just remember how much power there is in this sentence and how much it guides everything we have been doing. Okay, and so I also like, we can't really see this very well, but this is a hammer. And so I like to equate L2 phonology essentially with the hammer principle, the Maslow's hammer, who says that when all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And so essentially what's going on in L2 phonology, when we perceive a second language that is different from our first language, we initially over-rely on our familiar L1 processing routines, and we use our L1 system to decode this L2 speech. And so we can call this phenomenon L1-based processing. And so to illustrate this in a simple way, this is what happens. It's simplified. But we can maybe perceive a sound like rock, okay, an English word. And the English native listener will perceive this very smoothly and essentially processes very efficiently and will perceive rock. But in a second language, we use our first language system and categories and processing routines to in fact decode this auditory signal. And so there might be some slight adjustments to that perception that happens, right? So here in the case of a native Japanese listener, the R sound is not present in Japanese. They have something close that sounds a bit like L. And so they might essentially misperceive rock as lock, right? Under the influence of their L1 categories. And so this L1 processing is said to interfere with accurate perception of an L2, of a second language, in adulthood. And so generally, we can characterize this L1-based processing by interference or transfer from this L1 phonological knowledge during processing. And it's very difficult to modify later on, right? So once we have the L1 processing in place, when we are maybe 2 years old or, very, very early in life, it becomes extremely difficult to inhibit and to acquire a new way of processing speech. So the mental organization of phonology in the L1 influences pronunciation in L2 and perception via the processing system. So the L2 input processing is influenced by L1 at every level of phonological representation, sounds, syllables, prosody. And so it has important consequences across the board, right? As I was saying, it impacts production, perception, listening comprehension, lexical acquisition. And generally speaking, we can summarize the field to say that more exposure and more use lead to changes in the phonological system. And also explicit instruction has been shown to help. But when I write here lexical acquisition, until 2001, literally, we did not know much about the phonological content of L2 learners' lexical representation. So the fact that I'm able to write this here is actually quite big news in considering over the past 90 years. So let me tell you a bit more about this. In 2001, Pallier et al. Were the first to explore the consequences of misperceptions, like the ones I showed you between rock and lock, for lexical representations. So they were the first to wonder whether perceiving words with different vowels, with different consonants, different phonological dimensions, actually would lead to ambiguity in how these words are represented, right? Until then, nobody really had explicitly asked this question or wondered or formalized this question. So this is a screenshot of their paper. It's titled The Influence of Native Language Phonology on Lexical Access. And it's been quite influential, even though the paper itself is very short and there are all sorts of methodological issues connected with it. But this connection, at least for me, it just opened up this link between phonology and the lexicon, which was not, it wasn't, how do you say this? It wasn't common knowledge. It wasn't something that people were thinking about until then. Okay. And so this is an interesting quote from their paper, which really just explains this connection and honestly opens it to the world, I think, that was in a way that was really simple. So they say, here we consider the consequences for lexical representations when L2 learners have difficulties in creating separate phonetic categories for certain L2 sounds. It's reasonable to expect that a minimal pair of L2 words differing only in one phoneme contrast, like lock and rock, there's only one sound different here, that a minimal pair of these L2 words will be represented in the same way by L2 learners who do not possess the RL contrast. Indeed, if both L2 phonemes are assimilated to the same L1 phoneme, then the two words become homophones, sounding the same, right? So here what they're saying is that while there is a possibility that a contrast in the language might be neutralized when people hear and memorize the form of words, which is quite a wide-ranging, it has quite wide-ranging consequences, and in fact it did have a lot of consequences. And so let me illustrate. And so in fact what they found is exactly that. They found that there is quite a bit of ambiguity in the way the words are stored or accessed in a second language, right? And so what they essentially claim is that L2 learners remember many words the way they perceive them. So to illustrate, a rock is perceived as lock if you are a native Japanese speaker. And this is going to result in you storing a word with this lock form, right? But connecting it to the two different concepts. So the concepts are not merged, but they sound the same. Lock, they both have the same representation in the phonological term. And so they essentially become homophones. Okay. And then also there could be a consequence in the way this word is pronounced. So these results have been later on, there have been some more support for in fact, these ambiguities in the mental lexicon. And so until then, right, the fact that distinctions could be lost in the mental lexicon was essentially like a straight road ahead. Everything seemed very simple, right? So up until this point, the assumption was that perception determines phonolexical representations in a very similar way to L1 acquisition, like I was showing before. And so perception equals representations, in a very simplistic way at this time. What cannot be perceived cannot be learned or lexically encoded. And so essentially there was an unsaid possibility here that improving perception may be the road to accurate representations. Right? We don't know. However, not so fast. A few years later, it didn't last. This beautiful picture didn't last more than 3 years. So in 2004, everything changed with a paper by Weber, Andrea Weber and Ann Cutler, another landmark paper, really. They found that sometimes learners can separate words, right? So far, words would sound the same, but in their case, word would sound different, even though perception was not really helping. right? So without this reliable support from perception. And so here, this realization, so I can show you more specifically how they did that if you want to know in the question and answer. But generally, this paper was very important because it rattled this fundamental assumption that there's a linear connection between perception and representation. It suddenly shook the world a little bit, and we started to wonder, oh, wait a minute, in second language acquisition, maybe perception is not the same as representations. Maybe there is a disconnection here. And so this was very important, and so it prompted a lot of research on the role of perception and on the role of other factors in phonolexical encoding. And in particular, people were starting to wonder, so if they can't hear the difference, how on earth do learners know that these two words actually sound different? How can they tell that these two words are different, sound different, if the perception is not really reliable there, right? What other information? I mean, there must be other information that they rely on. And so this is where it becomes fascinating to see how much research has been triggered by these two papers combined. And so one of the first directions we went was the role of orthography, right? Immediately, Weber and Cutler, also Weber, Cutler, and Otake, proposed that possibly learners use different, when they're learning, they use different types of information, such as orthography. So a lot of research is being done on this area. It's very interesting, and it's not as clear. To be honest, the role of orthography is not very well understood yet. So there's more research to be done here. Also, the role of instruction, the role of training. Can learners be trained to make these distinctions, even though the perception is not super reliable? The role of feedback is very important as well. The role of lexical guidance. If you actually tell them that there are two words that are different, maybe can this make a difference? And a lot of other areas have been or are being developed here. So individual differences in the role of attention, for example. This is. There's a lot of work, but it's just beginning to explore the role of attention for lexical representations. There's not much yet in this area, but I think it's quite an interesting thing to look at. The role of how many other words we know, so the size of the vocabulary, the understanding that there are minimal pairs or the number of minimal pairs, right, in a language that support the importance of a contrast, and then other very interesting avenues to explore the role of word familiarity, like how well we know a word, how we know a word, the frequency of a word, how often we know these words, how often we hear these words, how isolated a word is in comparison to similar sounding words, etc. And then also, I would specifically mention Miriam and Ernesto's work here, to also open up the scope to stop focusing just on the word itself and to start taking the word in conversation, right, in a sort of larger unit maybe. And so this is a really interesting way also to look at this, and also how variable the words are. The role of variation interests me personally as well a lot. If a word is pronounced always with very little variation, or if there is a lot of variation in the input. Anyway, there are many different avenues of research here that are opening up pretty much every day because we're busy. Okay. And it also prompted some very interesting questioning about the shape of the representations themselves. And I would mention here the paper by Hazeharb and Masuda in 2008. So this is quite soon after this paper. That representations are probably not just merging contrasts, not just inaccurate. In fact, with Weber and Cutler, we started to wonder whether phonolexical representations perhaps can be ambiguous or open-ended, right? So there might be a way to not just have a wrong representation, but maybe a representation that's imprecise. And that was very interesting. So this is quite a long time ago. And I remember very clearly at the Second Language Research Forum in Pittsburgh in 2012, there was a morning, a very famous morning, on Friday, October 19th, in Rangos 2, that's the room, And here, I don't know if you can read it, but here there was a talk by Svetlana Cook and Kira Gore, and they explicitly proposed that representations could be fuzzy. And I remember this morning very well. I mean, I was presenting as well, and it was such an interesting, very intense morning where we were essentially just us talking about these questions. And so for me, the fuzzy representations were born there, even though they were obviously proposed a bit earlier, actually way earlier, by other people, but it was a really interesting morning session there. Okay, so we can distinguish 5 major open questions so far. And so far, the research I've presented has essentially addressed these first three. So why do learners have inaccurate representations in the first place? And what is the role of perception? And what are their representations actually like? Right? Are they globally fuzzy, just locally fuzzy? What's the scope of this fuzziness? And we don't really have a good answer to this just yet. And then, of course, the big question, the $1 million question, how do learners establish accurate representations? What factors do they use? And then things got even more complicated. So we also discovered that the converse dissociation occurs. So not just even when you cannot perceive something, you can do the representations well. No, the reverse is true also. Sometimes, even when perception is reliable, lexical representations are not. So there's really quite a, And so several people have observed this. Again, Hazar was a pioneer in a lot of these questions. And this has been shown several times after that as well. Many people have obtained further evidence of these dissociations where L2 learners are very well able to perceive a contrast, but this is not represented immediately, or at least not at the time of testing, in their mental representations. So we really, again, wonder, what is the role of perception in all this? And it definitely doesn't seem to be just like in L1, in first language, right? Improving perception may not be enough for accurate representations. So we're still figuring this out. And so, so far, a summary of what we know is that bilinguals have inaccurate representations for L2 words, or imprecise. And the form seems to echo the first language phonological structure, right? So we've talked about fuzzy phonolexical representations, and I think by now we are actually quite satisfied that this effect is representational, because these effects, in fact, persist once perception improves. So it's not only an issue of methodological inadequacies where perception during the task is not there, and therefore the access doesn't happen. So anyway, I think the field is maybe not completely satisfied, but we're I think, collectively in agreement that there might be something connected to representations. And encoding generally seems to echo this L1 system across the whole phonological system. So sometimes when I teach, I like to talk about these accented representations. Just like we have accented production or accented perception, we might have accented representations, such like for the word hello. The first word I learned, maybe in English, the first time I learned it, maybe I represented it as hello. Hello. Okay. So this could be the way I have stored this word, in fact. And so this is across the whole phonological system that makes up the word, the sounds, the syllable properties, the word properties. It's quite a complex constellation of phonological properties. And so the big question that we're faced with now is, how do we modify this representation to approach a more target-like representation such as hello, which I think I have acquired over the X number of years that I've been learning English. But I don't know how I did it. I certainly didn't notice when it happened, if it happened. So how do learners do this? How do they shift their representations to become more precise? The first question to ask is, do they? And so the question is, in fact, that representations seem to be a bit more like engraved memories. Remember, representations are stored in long-term memory, right? And so they might actually be a bit more stable than we initially all thought. And so they may be set in stone a little bit more than we thought. They are resistant to update, which means it is hard to change a word that we already know. And realizing this, to me, shifted the view a little bit, and we started considering the fact that time may play a role too, a dynamic connection between perception and representations over time. We started to see that perception matters at the moment of learning, but the updates do not linearly follow perceptual abilities. And so this brings us to the last two open questions. So can learners actually correct or update representations for words they know? And what are the mechanisms involved in such updates? And we know, the first good news is that we know that lexical representations do change over time. Learners build more detailed lexical representations, and there is a lot of accurate evidence that actually shows that. And let's take two words that are very difficult for French learners of English, like hello and herpetological. Those are two words I know. I learned hello on my first day of learning English, and herpetological, because I live in Indiana, it has to do with snake science. And so you have to know about these words when you live in Indiana. And so this is my English learning timeline. So I started learning English a long time ago, and I learned hello very, very early on. And maybe my representation was French accented, as I explained. And then by today, in 2022, I know hello, maybe in a different way. I don't know when this happened, but it did, I think. And then at some point, I learned herpetological. And so what we wonder is, to what extent is there a connection between the way I represent the word herpetological and the word hello, right? Is the one helping the other? Do I need hello first before I learn herpetological? Or did I correct hello because I knew herpetological? How does that work over time together with perceptual abilities? How do such updates take place? And what about this one? Do I still have this somewhere in my mind? Is this floating around like fish in the sea? Where is my hello? And the fact that I'm saying it 3 times here maybe is actually reinstating this representation in my brain. Okay, so ongoing research has been examining this question of development, and essentially the question of how representations evolve over time across the lexicon. That's another important question. How do those updates, if they happen for hello, do they automatically move to all other words containing an initial H? That's also a big question. So there are several directions here that we can mention. The age of words hypothesis, where maybe older words might work differently than more recently learned words, right? There is definitely some evidence to show that words we learn more recently behave slightly differently from the words that we are very familiar with. I think also your work, Svetlana, also shows that there's a large role of entrenchment and familiarity, but to understand how this works is very exciting, I think, right now. Another interesting question is, how long does it take, the time course, right? Can representations be updated rapidly, or does it take years or anything in between? And finally, what determines how easily certain representations update, not others, right? So that's also a really exciting line of research that Miguel and Brian Rocca are involved in, which I can't wait to see the results of. So to summarize here, one last time, we can say that while updates are possible, the mechanisms and the facilitating factors are still quite unclear. We know that perception matters somehow, at the time of learning probably, but a good perception does not guarantee updates later on, probably because words were learned before perception was improved, and representations are quite, engraved. I know I like this sense, this way that they're set in stone maybe a little bit. Not completely, but more than we thought. And so inaccurate representations can persist for a long time, and they're resistant to change. It's actually quite difficult to change them. And so many factors can help learners build more accurate representations. Knowing more words seems to be quite a driving force. metalinguistic knowledge, orthographic information, training. There's a lot of ways learners can improve their representations, but we are not completely clear about what are those facilitating factors, or even the mechanisms of updates themselves, right? For example, are learners overwriting their representation, or are they just building a new one next to the old one? Right? I think this is a really important question that we want to solve. So all these mechanisms remain open. But we are here today to make more headway in this area. So the major players in this field, and I don't know if you noticed, but I mean, I would say 95% of the literature on this topic is today present in this room. Of course, not, there are more than us, but I think we're representing a large proportion of that research collectively with our research groups. So I structured the talks around 3 themes. Miguel Jompart and Rachel Hazard will talk about interactions between words and the lexicon and perception, and about the methods we use. And I think the methodological aspects of all the research that we do is crucial. We really need to evaluate very critically the methods that we use in order to move forward on a very solid basis. So I think this is really, it's going to be very important to really think about the methods. And so from these 2 talks, we will get a more complete picture of the factors that impact phonolexical encoding. And then tomorrow, we'll hear talks by Miriam Ernestus and Svetlana Cook. They will open up the scope a little bit, and they will address issues more globally connected to familiarity, input characteristics, explore consequences for lexical access, word recognition. And, and also the issue of input characteristics is important, right? So what information in the input do people use, right? And that's the second theme in the middle, which is by Miren, Adrian, and Joan Carles Mora, who will explore the question of what if changing the input can help modify representations. Can we train listeners to change their representations by giving them a certain type of input? Right? So I think all these questions will be exciting for us to think about. And so I'm done. Thank you very much.